Morning, the race is on to rescue the people who survived this disaster. So we're going to start with Weekend World News anchor David Muir, who's in Hitachi, Japan. David, good morning to you.
Dan, good morning to you. And as those rescues continue, there's also another major need emerging, the humanitarian one. As we travel through rural Japan, we can't help but to notice the need for water. More than 1 million homes here without water. Food and gas is drying up. 2.5 million here have no electricity.
In the air and in the water, the frantic search for survivors continues. In this dramatic new video, watch as a rescue team pulls 2 small children from their destroyed home, reuniting them with their family on safe ground. For the last 24 hours here, helicopters have been circling the epicenter of destruction near Sendai, carrying survivors to safety. But for the thousands of people left without homes, water, or electricity, the desperation is starting to set in.
Have you ever seen anything like this?
We discovered the growing need as we circled that evacuation zone that's now been widened around those troubled nuclear reactors. We discover homes flattened, even in rural Japan, dozens of miles inland, and the lines are everywhere. This massive line just for water. And an 11-year-old girl who told us she's had no water for more than 2 days, filling up several jugs for her family.
Do you have any lights? Do you have any power?
She tells us her family has had no electricity, and like so many people here, they're now running short on food. This mother said she came out only because she had to. She was running out of food, but she was also very nervous to leave her home.
Are you nervous about the nuclear reactors?
Yes, she is very concerned, she told us, saying she doesn't know what to do. Telling us she's simply been following directions on television, not to go outside.
And that young mother, like so many parents I spoke with, concerned about the safety of their children, particularly with these scares involving the nuclear reactors. They say they're trying to follow the rules and the lessons being said on state television here, which is to stay in your home, keep the windows sealed. But at the same time, she simply said, I was running out of food. I had to go to the store, and that's why we ran into her there, like so many other families, heading out. Long lines everywhere for gas, water, and food here. Dan, Bianna, back to you.
All right, David.
And as you know, we're in Koriyama, west of those nuclear power plants, and we discovered the most telling image for us so far. Entire families lined up waiting to be scanned for radiation. These are the evacuees who were chased from their homes by disaster. And just as we met these families, we'd also learned of that second explosion. It was a terrifying sight, playing out on Japanese television yet again. Another hydrogen explosion at the same nuclear power plant in Fukushima. This time, a different nuclear reactor. The government insists here that so far the radiation levels are safe and that the containment vessel around the reactor is still intact. But there is growing concern here. Even the Pentagon has moved the USS Ronald Reagan, repositioned it away from the Fukushima plant after 3 helicopters flew through a low-level radiation plume. The military helos were flying some 60 miles from the shore when their sensitive detectors went off. And we discovered the line of families in the town of Koriyama waiting to be tested for radiation. Medical teams wearing white suits head to toe, using Geiger counters and handheld scanners to check everyone here, especially the most vulnerable, the children. This little girl stands as her hair is scanned as she patiently waits for the all clear. And this mother with her 2 children. They left their town behind. Is everyone okay? Her little girl shows me her Winnie the Pooh. But everyone is okay? Everyone's okay. They are okay, but the mother told us this has been like living through hell. Authorities here took us through the emergency command center. I can see you're all watching the monitor right now of the second explosion. Where they're not only helping families homeless from the earthquake, tonight this room right here will be full. But now 2 nuclear explosions, sending families fleeing for safety. That little girl clutching her Winnie the Pooh, her mother told me she doesn't know when, if they'll ever go back to their town. And one extraordinary number that while we were there in just one day alone, all of those families passing underneath that tent, there were more than 100 people who tested positive for radiation. And the authorities there on the scene told me they were all taken to local hospitals for further testing. Diane, back to you up north.
Muir is following all the developments from Koriyama, Japan. David?
George, good morning to you and Robin. And as you point out, at the Fukushima plant, there are 3 nuclear reactors. There have been explosions at 2 of them, 1 and 3. And as you point out, now concerned this morning about nuclear reactor number 2, that the fuel rods might have been partially exposed for a time. There are reports of that. And we also know that they've been putting seawater onto that plant as well. And that's a real sign that they've simply given up. They're trying to keep the reactor cool. But as you point out, new images this morning of just the sheer amount of damage at Fukushima to 1 and to 3, those 2 reactors had already exploded, the image from the sky, and of course the scene playing out all weekend long here in Japan. The last 24 hours, the image was of this most recent explosion. People glued to their television sets here and to the directions to stay inside your home for the people who live in that evacuation zone, to get away, and anyone else just beyond the evacuation zone to keep their windows closed and to stay inside. And as you know, we discovered driving along the perimeter this tent that was set up for many of the evacuees, families getting in line to be tested for possible radiation. These are the people who left their homes because of disaster. They say they're likely not going back. And Robin, as I reported in the first hour here, more than 100 people in just one day alone while we were there tested positive for radiation, now being tested further.
All right, David, thank you very much for your reporting.
And he has, of course, been with everybody right in the evacuation area from the beginning of this story. David.
And Diana, as I know, journeying from the north back down to Tokyo yourself, you've seen this image. Take a look at behind me this morning, and you can see the rows of cars. This is a giant gas line, and what you might not be able to tell at home is that it's actually 4 rows deep. And take a look at this. At the front of the line, they've actually assembled a couple of guards here to make sure that this goes very smoothly, not only because of the gas shortage, but because of that terrible explosion yesterday. People need gas to evacuate, and they're getting in line all over this country to do that.
It was Japan's 3rd explosion at a nuclear reactor, and by far the most dangerous, now leaking radiation, just as a 4th nuclear reactor then caught fire. Japan's prime minister went on television acknowledging that the radiation levels, quote, seem very high. He said there is still a very high risk of more radiation coming out. The government urged everyone within 30 kilometers to stay indoors, warning of more leaks in what's become the worst nuclear crisis since Chernobyl. The chief spokesman for the government acknowledged, "We're talking about levels that can damage human health," he said. "Please do not go outside. Please stay indoors. Please close windows and make your homes airtight." Many evacuees are now panicked. And in our trip away from the evacuation zone, we couldn't help but to notice those long gas lines.
So we're on this highway now, and you can see, we're sitting in traffic.
In many places, the traffic jammed after now 3 explosions, the first 2 caused by a buildup of hydrogen, sending the outer walls crumbling. This time, the roof did not blow off, which is why there was actually even more concern, because now it's believed the trapped pressure could have cracked the containment vessel around the reactor's core, allowing the radioactive material to seep out. It was the first time that nearly 800 workers in the nuclear plant were told to leave. It's believed just 50 of those workers remain. Since the earthquake and tsunami, authorities have scrambled to do this, to cool the core of the reactors, turning to seawater as a last resort, knowing it would destroy the reactors for good. But even then, the water at times evaporating more quickly than they could even pump it in.
Cooling the reactors has been the largest hurdle of all. And one of the things I wanted to point out is that we've been carrying around a Geiger counter because we traveled pretty close into that evacuation zone, and we monitored it from time to time, obviously, and had very regular readings until about an hour ago, just north up on the highway. As we approached Tokyo, the readings started to spike. And Robin and George, I know you mentioned at the top of the broadcast those readings, that radiations from simply the wind blowing south had carried some of the radioactive particles this way, which explains why in the car as we were traveling, you can hear the pulse count here. It started to shoot off and the numbers began to spike. So we saw exactly what they've been reporting these last 24 hours.
And David, that's why that you and others are headed now to Tokyo. Please take every precaution that you can. And we're going to get back to you a little bit later.
David Muir is ahead of us, and I want to learn from him what he's seeing at the location where he is. He has been following the evacuation since the very beginning. David?
Good morning again to you, and you can see this gas line continues here behind me, and this is a scene repeated across this country, particularly after that third and most dangerous explosion yet. There are so many evacuees who are trying to get away from those nuclear reactors that have caused such trouble and such fear here these last 24 hours. They need gasoline to do that, but we also witness food shortages, water shortages throughout rural Japan. It's going to be a real problem here as they try to decipher just how dangerous this most recent explosion was. Robin, George, back to you.
David Muir, he has been tracking the nuclear reactors, what has happened with the stricken ones, and he joins us now from Tokyo this morning. David?
Robin, good morning from Tokyo. This was an alarming development after learning that for a time all work had been stopped at the Fukushima plant. And we'd learned this after already knowing that just 50 workers remain at the plant, that they had sent all of the rest of them to a safer place. Now, this morning we have learned that they are trying to access these reactors in different ways. There are new pictures of helicopters trying to carry in seawater before their mission being aborted. And all of this comes as we get new images of the damage to those reactors. This morning, new images of the incredible amount of damage at reactors 3 and 4. Large portions collapsed, and there is a giant hole in the 4th reactor. The inside is visible. All of this comes after that dramatic and ominous development, Japanese officials acknowledging that they had suspended operations at the Fukushima nuclear plant after deeming radiation levels were too dangerous for workers to remain at the facility. And the fear is growing among the Japanese people. The chief spokesman for the government went on television saying, "We might need help of U.S. military fighting the nuclear accident." Already, 750 of the nuclear plant workers had been told to leave to find a safe place. Only about 50 had remained. And now it's believed even they have been told to stop for a time. Japanese officials have even considered using helicopters to dump water onto one of the reactors. Now even that idea has been deemed unlikely to work. Pictures this morning show those helicopters trying. They had to stop. It's believed those last 50 workers were already the final line of defense, working frantically in an all-out race. And nuclear experts tell us they're likely wearing full bodysuits with air packs and had been rotating in and out on strict schedules, trying to minimize their exposure. Radiation sickness can begin to set in rapidly at levels of 1,000 millisieverts. That's the equivalent of 25,000 chest x-rays. If exposed, symptoms are immediate, from vomiting to a steep decline in white blood cells, wiping out their immune system. Right now, the radiation levels have retreated slightly from their peak of 10 millisieverts, the equivalent of one CT scan for every hour of exposure. Overnight, reactor number 4 caught on fire for a second time in 24 hours. Since the earthquake and tsunami, one reactor exploded after another. 3 explosions in all, and now those continued fires in one of the reactors. Again, this morning, they are trying multiple efforts to try to get back to those reactors at the Fukushima plant after calling all work off, even for the 50 workers who did remain. But as you saw there, those helicopter missions were aborted. We've also learned that authorities here in Japan have raised the radiation limit that had been set for workers for exposure at that plant. They've now set it at a level 2 times where it had been. George, back to you.
So they are under even more risk right now. Checking now with David Muir. He's at JFK Airport here in New York. Just got off a flight from Japan. And David, that flight was just packed with Americans trying to get out.
It sure was, George. We talked to a lot of them, including one couple from North Carolina, the husband leaving his job early. They just decided it wasn't safe enough. They wanted to be back home with their family in North Carolina. And the Americans who were on this flight, it was a commercial flight from Haneda Airport, which is just southwest of Tokyo, all made their decision to get out before they even heard from the State Department. But as we learned right there at the airport just outside of Tokyo, this is a difficult decision for many families, who stays and who goes. Just as we began talking to Todd Grice of Atlanta.
South Bend, Indiana. Your son's saying bye, Daddy. Goodbye, buddy.
Will you gonna be sad? Bye-bye.
He's sad too.
It turns out his boys had something far more important to say, goodbye. They were waving to their dad, leaving Japan for a break from school with their mother. He is staying behind for work with Coca-Cola.
Is it tough to say goodbye to them, knowing what's going on here? It's tough to say goodbye just because I know they're struggling so much. And it's with the unknowns, nobody knows. Goodbye, buddy.
Inside the gate, we meet up with his wife, Wendy, who says family back home in Atlanta, particularly Grandma, has been worried sick.
She's been really worried and really not believing that we're okay, so just to have proof that we are fine.
And with that, they were off, the 3 little boys in tow and their carry-on luggage, knowing that Dad will try to meet up with them sometime next week. all of them hoping to return to a safer Japan.
Cutest little guys carrying their luggage there. I want to point out that Martha mentioned that 50-mile evacuation zone that the U.S. is now enforcing. Todd does not live there, so in staying behind, he's in Tokyo, but he'll have to watch those winds. And the State Department also mentioned that to beware of the wind direction because of the radiation that can sometimes carry the particles with it. And now Todd and his family decided to move to Japan from Atlanta for 3 years or so. So they are hoping that after this break that the family will return to a safer Japan, a better picture than what they've seen these last couple of days. George.
Okay, David, thanks very much.